Hannah Pettifer did not once shout at the carters. Not in 7 years. Every morning they came down Marston Lane before the sun cleared the malthouse roofs, 3 cartloads of them, and they tipped their loads on the waste ground behind her cottage. Spent barley. Wet grain, boiled out and thrown off the mash, hot as a fresh loaf when it fell. The steam of it drifted through her open scullery door. It soured the milk on her own shelf before she'd had her breakfast. And she said nothing. She stopped hanging her washing on that side, that was all. She took the pegs and moved them to the front, where the smell was only bad and not unbearable, and she let the men do their work. You want to know what they said when she asked them, quiet and civil, to tip it somewhere else. At the vestry she stood up and asked before 11 ratepayers, and the brewery's yard manager, a man named Ferris, looked at her the way you'd look at a cracked cup. It's brewer's muck, missus, he said, worth less than the mud it rots into. The Board of Health wrote 3 words in their book, no nuisance proven, and they closed it. But there was a Welsh drover watering his cattle at the trough one afternoon. He leaned on her wall and looked at that steaming heap, and he said the townsmen paid good money for that same grain, fresh off the mash. His father had fed 40 beasts on it. Then he clicked his tongue at his cows and walked on down the lane before she could ask him a single thing more. If you've ever looked at what everyone called rubbish and seen what it could become, this story is for you. Before we go on, do me one small kindness. Subscribe to the channel and in the comments tell me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Hannah's story travels. Now, let me tell you how it began. Hannah Pettifer had kept the same cottage on Marston Lane, on the edge of Burton, since the year she married Tom. That was a long time back. The cottage was small and low, 2 rooms down and 1 above, with a scullery built on at the back like an afterthought. It had a good front step and a bad drain, and a garden the size of a tablecloth. But it was hers, or near enough hers. Tom had paid it down over the years, shilling by shilling, out of what a malt-kiln man earns, which is not much. Tom was the kiln. That was his trade. He tended the malt floors and the drying kiln at one of the maltings that fed the great brewing town, turning the green malt on the flue and reading the heat by the feel of the air and the colour of the grain. He knew heat the way a baker knows dough. Too hot and you scorch it, and the beer comes out burnt. Too cool, and it sweats and spoils. There is a right heat, and a good kiln man lives at that right heat all day, every day, breathing the dust of it. That dust took him in the end. The kiln cough, they called it. It settled in his chest over the years and never left, and one hard winter it carried him off. He was gone by the March. Hannah buried him and came home and sat in the front room and did not know, for a while, what a woman does next. What she did was take in mending. She had good hands and good eyes still, and word got round. Shirts and sheets, a torn petticoat, a farmer's coat with the pocket gone. It kept her in bread and coal and not much beyond. She was near 52, and she had no wish for pity, and she asked no one for anything. She wanted to be left in peace on her own step. That was the whole of what she wanted, but behind the cottage lay the waste ground, and on the waste ground was the heap. Here is how the heap came to be there, so you understand the wrong of it. Years back, before Tom died even, the strip of rough ground behind the cottage belonged to a landlord. An old man, and by the telling a careless one. The brewery down the lane, Ansley Croft, a middling firm with a big yard, wanted somewhere cheap and near to throw its spent grain, and the old landlord said yes, tip it there, and took whatever they gave him for it, and thought no more. Then the old landlord died, and the arrangement did not die with him. There was no paper, no living person had signed a thing, but the carts kept coming, because they had always come, and no one with the power to stop them saw any reason to. So Hannah, when Tom died, inherited a cottage and a garden and a view of a rubbish heap that grew back every morning, no matter what the weather did to it. Let me tell you what 3 cartloads a day is. It is more than you are picturing. The first morning's load comes down hot and sweetish, and for an hour or two it smells almost like something you could eat, like the inside of a brewery, warm and grainy. That is the trick of it. That is what fooled everyone. By the afternoon it has cooled. By the second day it has begun to turn, and the sweetness goes off into something thick and sour at the back of the throat. By the third day it is rank. And every morning a fresh 3 loads went on top of the turning, souring, rotting old, so that the heap was always steaming at one end and stinking at the other. The rats came for it, of course. Rats in numbers Hannah had never seen. They ran the wall tops at dusk, bold as cats, and got into her coal store and her thin thatch, and once into the very scullery, and she stood on a chair with her heart going like a drum until it found the door again. The drain behind the privy, that bad drain that had never been much good, fouled up entirely with the wash of it in the wet months, so that the yard would not dry and the standing water lay green. And her stepdaughter Ruth. Ruth was in service over in Derby, a good place, a proud girl who had worked hard to get out and up. Ruth would write and say she was coming Sunday to see her mother, and Hannah would sit with the letter and not answer it, or answer it to say don't, not this week, I'm poorly, the road's bad, anything, because she could not bear for Ruth to come round the corner of Marston Lane and smell what her mother lived beside. Could not bear the look on the girl's face. Shame is a heavy thing to carry alone, and Hannah carried it in silence, and only once, folding a letter away, did she say aloud to the empty room a thing she did not know she'd remember. She said the stuff had steamed like a fresh loaf that first morning, before it turned. Then she put the letter in the drawer and went back to her mending. Now, she did try. Do not think she sat and suffered without lifting a hand. She was not that sort. She tried the proper way, the way you're told to try, and I want you to watch how each door closed, because the closing of those doors is the whole reason 7 years went by. First she went to the brewery yard itself, to Ferris. She stood at the gate in her good shawl and asked him plainly if the tipping might go somewhere else, seeing as it fouled her drain and brought the rats. And Ferris, a broad man with an inked ledger under his arm and no time in his face, told her the arrangement was old and settled and none of her affair. The ground was not hers, he said. It was not hers to bargain over. Take it up with the landlord. And when she said the landlord was 7 years dead, he shrugged the way a man shrugs at the weather and went back inside. That was the first door. Then the vestry. She screwed up her courage and went before the parish, before 11 ratepayers sat on their hard chairs, and she said her piece as clear as she could. And Ferris was there for the brewery, and Ferris said the line that everyone in the lane would still be quoting years on. He said, "It's brewer's muck, misses, worth less than the mud it rots into," and a couple of the men laughed, not unkindly even, which was worse than cruel, and the chairman thanked her for coming and moved to the next business. That was the second door, and it shut with 11 men watching. Then the Board of Health. There is an inspector for such things, a sanitary inspector, a Mr. Hartle, whose whole office is to look at nuisances and order them cleared. And here you would think, surely here. A rotting heap, a foul drain, rats, surely the board acts. Hartle came, even. He came and looked and held his handkerchief to his nose. But Ansley Croft's name was on the subscription list of that very board. The brewery paid toward it, sat near it, dined with it, and Hartle wrote in his book in a good clear hand 3 words, "No nuisance proven," and he closed the book and touched his hat and went away. That was the third door. So there is your open question, and hold on to it, because the whole story turns on it. Why would no one lift that heap? Why, in 7 years, did not one man with a cart and an hour spare it? Here is the plain, ugly reason. It cost the brewery only 2 carters' wages to be rid of the stuff by tipping it behind a widow's cottage, and it cost the authorities nothing at all to look the other way. Doing right cost money, and effort. Doing nothing cost neither. And so nothing was done, morning after morning, load after load, for 7 years. Now let me bring you to the morning it changed. It was July, high summer, and the worst month for the heap, because the heat worked on it, and the smell rose thick, and the flies hung over the waste ground in a haze. Hannah was at her step early, before the carters even, and the air was already heavy, and round the corner of the lane, unannounced, with no letter sent and no warning given, came Ruth. She had a half-day and had taken the carrier and come on impulse to surprise her mother, the way a loving girl does. And she came up the lane light-footed and smiling, and then the smell caught her. Hannah saw it happen, saw her daughter's step falter at the gate, saw the hand go up to the mouth, saw the smile go to something else. Ruth gagged. She could not help it. She stood at her own mother's gate with her hand over her mouth and her eyes filling, and when she could speak she said, half crying, "Mother, you live in a midden. You never told me it was like this. You live in a midden." Hannah did not cry. I want you to mark that. She did not cry, though it was the hardest morning of the 7 years, harder than any of the shut doors. Because a shut door is only a stranger's contempt, and this was her own child's grief for her. She stood straight, and she put her arm round Ruth, and she said, "It's only grain, love, it's only grain." And she meant to say more, some comfort, though there was none. And it was just then, over the wall, that the drover spoke. He was a Welshman, a cattle drover moving beasts along the lane toward the market road, and he'd stopped his herd at the stone trough by Hannah's wall to let them drink. He'd been watching the two of them, not meaning to intrude. But he looked at the steaming heap on the waste ground, and something in a drover's mind woke up, and he leaned his forearms on the top of her wall and spoke, easy and plain, the way a countryman speaks of country things. "In the towns they'd pay you for that," he said. He nodded at the heap. "Fresh off the mash, that. My father fed 40 beasts on the like of it, winter through. Good feed, fattening." Then he shook his head, almost sorry, and said the 5 words that were the whole trap and the whole answer at once. "Pity, it won't keep." And he clicked his tongue and roused his cattle up from the trough and drove them on down the lane, the dust rising behind them, gone before Hannah could gather herself to call after him. She never learned his name that day. He never came back for thanks. He dropped that one true sentence over her wall and walked out of the story forever. Pity it won't keep. Ruth wiped her eyes and did not understand what she'd heard, but Hannah stood very still on her step, with her arm round her daughter, and looked at the heap, that same heap she had hated for 7 years, and for the first time she did not see rubbish. She heard the drover's voice in her head. They'd pay you for that. And then the second half, cutting the first half off at the knees. Pity it won't keep. Now the tone of everything changes. Watch it turn. Because Hannah Pettifer was a kiln man's widow, and though she'd not known it that morning, she of all women in Burton was fitted to answer the very question the drover had left hanging. But she did not leap. She was not a leaping woman. She tested it first. She was careful, and she was slow, and she wanted to know if the Welshman had told the truth. So the next day, when the fresh load came down, she took a bucketful of it, the fresh stuff, off the top, that morning's still warm, and she carried it round to a neighbour who kept a pig. "Feed your pig on this," she said, "and tell me true what he makes of it." And the pig fell on it, ate it down and rooted for more, and did well on it, and the neighbour said, half a joke, that she should bring a bucket every day. There. The drover was right. Fresh, it was good feed, good enough that a pig would fatten on it and a dairyman would pay for it. But Hannah did the second half of the test too, because she was thorough, and because a careful woman tests the bad news as well as the good. She took another bucket of the same grain, and she set it by, in a corner, and she let it stand. 1 day. 2 days. On the 3rd day she carried that soured bucket round to the same pig, and the pig would not touch it, turned its snout from it, backed off. The very same grain 3 days older, and the animal that had gobbled it fresh now would not put its nose to it. And that, right there, was the whole thing. That was why 7 years had gone by with no one seeing it. The towns where a man would pay for good feed were 4 miles off. The grain went sour in 3 days. 4 miles is a morning's cart, easy, but not if what you're carting turns to stinking waste before the week is out. Fresh, it was a commodity. 3 days on, it was a nuisance. And there was no way that anyone knew to get it the 4 miles into town still sweet, because it simply would not keep. So it was not sold. It was tipped. Behind her cottage. For 7 years. Not out of pure malice, though there was contempt enough, but because it genuinely would not keep, and a thing that will not keep is worth nothing. However good it is the day it's made. Pity it won't keep. And now, Hannah Pettifer remembered her husband's trade. She sat by her cold grate that night, and it came to her slow and then all at once. Wet grain spoils. Everyone knew that. But Tom had spent his whole working life doing one thing to grain. One thing every day for a wage. He dried it. That was malting. You take the wet green malt and you dry it slow over a flue until it will keep for a 12-month in a sack and never turn. Dry grain keeps. Wet grain spoils. She had lived 30 years beside a man whose entire craft was the turning of wet perishable grain into dry, keeping grain, and it had taken a stranger's 5 words over a wall to make her see that the answer to the heap had been sitting at her own hearth all along. Wet spoils. Dry keeps. If she could dry the spent grain, dry it properly, the way Tom dried malt, over a flue at the right heat, then the 3 days would become 3 months, and 4 miles would be nothing, and the heap behind her cottage would stop being muck and start being money. But knowing a thing and doing it are 2 different roads. She had no kiln. So she went to old Mr. Big, who had a disused malting a little way off, a good stone building gone quiet since the trade moved on, with its kiln floor still sound and its flue still whole, and she asked him what he'd take to let her use it. And old Big, who liked her and thought her a bit touched but harmless, said a shilling a week and don't burn it down. And she paid him his first shilling out of her mending money and had her kiln. The first winter was failure, and I'll tell you it plainly, because the failing is the truest part. Wet spent grain is very wet, far wetter than green malt. Sopping, you cannot just spread that on a kiln floor and dry it. It will sit and steam and mould before it dries. So first she had to get the water out of it. She thought on it and she borrowed the frame of a cheese press, that great wooden press with the screw that squeezes the whey from the curd, and she packed the wet grain into cloths and pressed it, screwing it down hard, forcing the liquor to run out on the stone floor in a brown stream. And that helped. It came out as a firm pressed cake, much drier. She was pleased. She thought she had it. But the pressed cake still moulded. Pressed was not dry. It was only less wet. Left a week, even pressed, it grew its blue-green fur and spoiled, and her first winter's work went bad in the sacking, and she stood in old Big's malting and looked at her spoiled cake and did not weep, but came very near. The second winter she did the thing Tom would have done, the thing she should have trusted from the start. She stopped trying to make the pressing do the whole job. She pressed the grain, yes, to force out the free liquor, but then she carried the pressed cake up onto the kiln floor and she broke it and spread it thin, a shallow bed, not a heap, because a heap won't dry through, over the flue. And then she did the one thing no one else in Burton could have done half so well. She read the heat. Because here is where a kiln man's craft is not a thing you can guess at. Dry that grain too hot, and it chars, it scorches and goes bitter and black, and no beast will eat it, and the whole floor is ruined. Dry it too cool, and it sweats, it never dries through, it just sits warm and damp and moulds worse than before. There is a narrow right heat, a slow, gentle toasting heat, and you must hold it there for hours, and you cannot hold what you cannot measure. And on Hannah's mantelpiece, where it had sat since the day they carried Tom home, was Tom's brass kiln thermometer, his own, the tool of his trade. She had kept it there as you keep a dead man's watch, not for use, only for love. Now she took it down off the mantel, and she carried it up to old Big's kiln, and she set it in the drying bed, and she read her husband's heat off her husband's brass, and she held the flue exactly where Tom would have held it. Not too hot to scorch, not too cool to sweat, right in the narrow middle where the grain toasts slow and golden and dries clear through to keeping dry. She sat up with it half the night, feeding the fire small, watching the needle, turning the bed with a wooden rake so it dried even. The malting filled with a smell, and oh, mark this smell, because it is the opposite of the heap, a warm, toasted, grainy smell, like bread, like the good honest inside of a brewery, with no sourness in it at all, and by the grey of the morning she had a floor of grain that was dry, truly dry, dry as Tom's malt. She raked it and sacked it, and it did not steam, and it did not turn. She filled one sack that first true night, one good sack, tied at the neck. And she did not sell it, she did not run to anyone. She carried it home and put it up in the loft, out of sight, and she said nothing to a soul, not even Ruth. She set Tom's thermometer back on the mantel where it belonged, and she waited. Because it is one thing to make grain dry, it is another thing entirely for it to keep, and she had been fooled once by the pressed cake that looked dry and moulded anyway. So she would not crow, not this time, not until she knew. She left that sack in the loft, and she went back to her mending, and she let the weeks go by, and every few days she climbed up and put her hand to it and her nose to it, and told no one what she was waiting to learn. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of carters arriving, of the heap steaming behind her cottage, of the smell drifting through the scullery door and souring her mornings. 6 weeks of mending shirts and trouser knees and keeping Tom's thermometer on the mantel where it always sat, innocent-looking, saying nothing. Then one grey Tuesday she climbed up into the loft with the candle. She did not hurry. She had schooled herself against hurrying. She held the light close, and she put her hand into the neck of the sack, and she pressed her palm into the grain, and it was dry. Cool dry, the way good stored malt is cool and dry, with that faint sweet smell still in it, the toasted bread smell. Unchanged, she pressed her nose to her own wrist where the dust had caught, and she breathed it. No sourness, no mowed damp, no rot. 6 weeks and it had kept. She did not shout, she did not sit down on the loft boards and weep, though she might have been forgiven it. She stood with her candle in one hand and her palm against the grain, and she was very quiet for a long moment, the way you are quiet when a thing you only half believed turns out to be absolutely true. Then she retied the sack neck, neat and tight, and she came back down the ladder and she put the kettle on. There are mornings that hinge, that are one thing before the kettle boils and another thing after. This was one of those mornings. But Hannah Pettifer did not mark it ceremonially. She drank her tea, she washed the cup, and she began to work out what she needed. She needed a clean sack. A good one, not patched, not smelling of old feed or rope tar, the kind a buyer might open and not flinch at. She needed to fill it from the loft and carry it, and she needed to know where precisely to go. The drover had said the towns. In the towns they'd pay you for that, fresh off the mash. 4 miles to Burton centre was nothing. But fresh meant within the day, fresh she had failed at. What she had now was not fresh. What she had now was something else, something the drover had not said was possible, something the yard manager Ferris had said flatly was worth less than the mud it rots into. She had preserved it. That was the whole of it. 3 words that contained the 7 years of nuisance and the 1 winter of nights beside old Big's flue and her dead husband's thermometer and the 6 weeks of saying nothing. She had preserved it. She went to Peel Street. She had passed it before, the cellar dairies that kept Burton's milk and cream trade, the steep steps down, the low doors. The smell of hay and cow breath rising from underground even in the street above. She had never had cause to knock. Now she did. She knocked at the door of the first one she knew by name, Mrs. Doty, a widow herself, keeping 8 shorthorns in the deep cellar under the corner house, selling sweet milk by the jug to the houses round about. Mrs. Doty came to the door with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and looked at the woman and the sack without much expression. Hannah said she had dried brewers' grain to sell, and she had brought a sample. Mrs. Doty said she bought her feed from Hadley's and always had. Hannah said she knew that, but she had brought the sample regardless, and if Mrs. Doty would give it a proper look before sending her away, she would take up no more of her mourning than that. She said it without pleading, just stated it, the way you state a fact. She had learned, across 7 years of closed vestry books and filed and forgotten inspectors' reports, that pleading did not move people, and that a plain statement of terms sometimes did. Mrs. Doty looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back and let her in. The cellar was low and warm and smelled of straw and the sweet animal breath of 8 beasts standing in their stalls, and Hannah stood there while Mrs. Doty opened the sack and dipped her hand in and smelled it and rubbed it between her fingers. The way a woman who has bought feed for 20 years knows how to read it. She said, "What's it worth?" Hannah named a price. It was below Hadley's. Not far below, she was not desperate, but enough that a careful woman keeping 8 cows on a tight margin would hear it. Mrs. Doty said, "It's dry enough." "And it keeps?" Hannah said, "I kept that sack 6 weeks in my loft, and it came out exactly as you have it there." Mrs. Doty looked at it again. She said, "I'll take a weekly order. 2 sacks to start, and if it goes over with them," she nodded at the 8 calm faces in the stalls, "we'll talk about 3. Hannah walked home the 4 miles with an empty sack folded under her arm and a weekly order in her head, and she did not smile until she was past the last houses and out on the open road where no one could see her. 2 sacks a week. She said the number to herself. It was not much. But it was a beginning, and a beginning was a thing she had not had in 7 years. She was near 52 that summer, and she had learned to want small things and hold them tight. The second dairy came of its own accord. Mrs. Doty talked, the way women who keep cows talk over a shared wall, and within the month a man named Kilbourne, who kept 6 beasts in a cellar off the same street, sent word by a boy that he would try a sack himself. Hannah dried it and sacked it and carried it round. Kilbourne dipped his hand in and smelled it, same as Doty had, and paid her on the spot. So now it was 3 sacks a week, then 4, and here is the thing that no one in the town could yet see. The brewery was still tipping. Every morning the 2 carters brought their 3 cartloads of spent barley round to the waste ground behind Marston Lane and turned them out, hot and steaming, and drove off again. Ferris still signed their time. Croft still paid their wages. The heap still rose behind Hannah's cottage, the same as it had for 7 years, and Hannah was carrying it off, drying it, selling it back into the very town that had thrown it away. She was buying nothing. She was taking what the brewery paid 2 men to be rid of and turning it into money on her own kitchen table. The brewery could not see it. Ferris passed her in the lane and touched his hat and thought her a tidy widow with a cart. He did not think to ask where the cart was going. Why would he? It was muck. He had said so himself, before 11 men, and a man does not go looking to see where his muck has got to. That was the sweetness of it. The whole town went about its business, and only Hannah knew what was moving through her hands. By the autumn the cellar dairies could not take all she made, and she went looking further. Sam Odell kept the carrier's yard on the Derby Road, and he had 8 big dray horses that ate their heads off through the winter. Hay was dear that year, and hay rotted in a damp loft, and a horsekeeper who has watched good hay go to mould is a man ready to listen. Hannah brought him a sack, She told him plainly what it was and where it came from, and that it kept. That was always the thing she said last, and said flat, because it was the thing that mattered. It keeps. Hay won't. This will. Odell fed it out through a hard January, and his horses came up glossy on it, and he told her to bring him 2 sacks a week and keep bringing them. Then the word travelled where she had never thought to send it. Out at Hifalong there was a training stable, racehorses, clean-legged nervous things worth more than her cottage each, and the head lad there was a careful man named Vesey. He heard of the feed from Odell, or from Odell's brother, she never rightly knew which. He sent a note asking her to bring a sample out. Hannah walked the road to Hifalong, not knowing what to make of it. A racing stable. She had never stood among horses like that in her life. Vesey met her in the yard and took the sample, and did not smell it and rub it the way the dairy women did. He sent it in to be looked at by men who knew more than he did, and he kept her waiting the better part of an hour in the cold, and then he came back out and said he would take a standing order every week, and that she was to tell no one his price, which was better than she had dared to name. She walked home from Hifalong in the dark, and did the sum in her head the whole way, and the sum kept getting bigger, and she had to stop and start it over twice, because she did not trust it. She fixed the drain that winter. The foul drain behind the privy that had run bad for 7 years, and that no vestry and no board of health would touch, she paid a man out of her own pocket to dig it out and lay it fresh, because still, after everything, no one else would. She had a rat catcher in too, and cleared the last of them, and had the back of the cottage lime-washed white where the damp of the heap had greened it. She did all of it herself, with her own money, the money the muck had made. And she wrote to Ruth. She had not been able to write to Ruth in years, not properly, not the truth of things, because the truth was the heap and the smell and the shame of it, and a mother does not put her shame in a letter to a daughter in service. Ruth had come once, that July, and gagged at the gate and wept, and said her mother lived in a midden, and gone away again, and after that the letters between them had been thin and careful things that said nothing. Now Hannah wrote and told her. All of it. The drover's line, Tom's thermometer, the kiln she rented from Old Big for £1 a week, Mrs., Doty and Kilbourne, and Odell, and the racing stable at Hifalong. She even wrote the sums, which she had never done with anyone, because she wanted Ruth to see the size of the thing. Ruth wrote back the same week. It was a long letter, and Hannah read it standing at the door, and then sat down to read it again. Ruth was proud. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. She was proud, and she was sorry for the July morning at the gate, sorry for the word she had used, and she said so plainly. And she said the family she was in service to at Derby kept a good stable, and she would speak to their coachman, and she thought she might send her mother custom from Derby itself. She did too. 2 Derby yards took Hannah's grain that spring on Ruth's word, carried up by rail in the sacks. So the girl who had wept that her mother lived in a midden was now sending her mother trade from another town. Hannah kept that letter in the tea caddy and did not tell anyone she kept it. By the spring she needed more grain than the fresh heap held. That was the trouble with success. The dairies and the carriers and the racing stable together wanted more dried grain than she could make from 3 cartloads a day, because a deal of the wet weight cooked off in the drying, and she had to press and dry a great heap of wet to fill a single sack. To feed the trade she now had, she needed the whole of what the brewery tipped, and some days she needed it faster than they tipped it. So she began to go to the yard. She took her own cart up to the brewery gate of a morning and loaded the spent grain straight from the mash, fresh and hot, before it ever went round to the waste ground at all. It saved the carters a journey, and it saved her one, and at first no one said a word, because it was still only muck going out of the gate, and no one at Ansley and Croft troubled themselves over the direction muck took. But now Hannah was there, in the yard, every morning. Visible, and Ferris, who had passed her 100 times in the lane and thought nothing, now watched her load her cart in his own yard, day after day, week after week, and a slow frown began to gather on him. A widow does not come to a brewery yard every morning for muck. He watched her fill the cart and drive it out sweet and heavy, and one morning he did not touch his hat to her, and Hannah, feeling his eyes on her back, knew that the quiet part of it was ending. It ended in Croft's counting house, though Hannah was not there to see it start. Josiah Croft was the partner who kept the books, and Croft was a man who could not bear a shilling to go out of the door unaccounted. Ferris went to him with the frown still on him, and said there was a widow carting off all their spent grain daily, and he thought she might be selling it. Croft did not much care, at first. Then he did the thing that no one at the brewery had done in 7 years. He did the sum. He sat with his ledger open, and he worked out what the brewery spent to be rid of the grain, 2 carters, their wages, the horse, the year round, and it came to £95 a year. £95 a year to bury the stuff. Then he sent a clerk out, quiet, to find where the widow's cart went and what she got for what was on it. And the clerk came back with numbers, and Croft laid the numbers against his £95 and went very still. The dairies, the carriers, the training stable at Hifalong, sacks carried up by rail as far as Derby. He totted what she must be taking across a year, and the figure he came to was near £2,000. £2,000 a year. He was paying £95 to throw away a thing that was earning a widow near 2,000. Croft did not feel foolish, which would have been the honest thing to feel. He felt robbed. That was the shape of the man. He looked at his own 7 years of £95 bills, and he did not think. We were blind. He thought, she has been taking what is ours. He sent for Hannah. She came and stood in the counting house with her hands folded, and Croft did not ask her to sit. He told her that the spent grain was the property of Ansley and Croft. He told her that she had been removing it, his word, removing, as though she had come in the night, for the best part of a year without leave and without payment. He said the arrangement behind Marston Lane had been a tipping arrangement, a favour to the widow if anything, and that it had never given anyone leave to trade in the brewery's goods. He said, henceforth, she would pay 3 shillings a load for every load she took out of the yard. And then he said the thing that told Hannah exactly what manner of man she was dealing with. He said that as she had been taking the grain the better part of a year already, there stood against her something in the way of arrears, and he named £150. £150. For the muck he had paid 2 men to throw away. He gave her 14 days. 14 days to agree his terms and pay down his arrears, or the yard gates were shut to her cart, the grain locked in, and sold to another man who would meet his price. Hannah stood and heard all of it out. She had customers now. She had a standing order from Hifalong she had promised to keep. She had Odell's horses, and Doty's cows, and Kilbourne's, and 2 yards in Derby depending on her every week. And she had, when it came to the law of the thing, no right to a single sack. Croft was right in that, and she knew he was right. It was the brewery's grain. It had always been the brewery's grain. She had built the whole of it on a thing she did not own, because for 7 years no one had thought it worth owning. She said she would want the 14 days to consider, and she left. She did not go to the yard and fight. She did not raise her voice any more than she had raised it at the Carters 7 years before. Shouting had never once served her. The vestry had not heard shouting. Hartle had not heard it. She knew the worth of it, which was nothing. She went instead to a solicitor's, to a clerk named Sowerby, who drew papers for tradesmen and did not charge the earth, and she laid the whole of it before him, plain, and Sowerby, hearing it, saw at once the thing that Croft in his greed had not seen, and that Ferris in his contempt had never troubled to make. There was no paper. In 7 years no one had ever drawn a paper. The tipping behind Marston Lane had been a dead landlord's arrangement that no living person had signed. The brewery owned the grain, yes, but the brewery had never once put in writing who might have it, on what terms, or for how long. Croft could demand 3 shillings a load this fortnight. But a demand shouted across a counting house was not a contract, and it bound no one, and next year he might demand 5, or shut her out for a rival, or change his mind on a whim. She had nothing to stand on, and so long as it stayed that way, she never would. The answer was not to fight Croft's demand. The answer was to give the brewery the one thing it had never had, and make it worth their signing. Sowerby drew it up to her instruction, and it was Hannah's instruction, not his, for she saw the shape of it the moment he showed her the gap. She would go back to Croft. She would not haggle the 3 shillings. She would offer more than he had thought to ask, and take, in return, the one thing worth more than any of it. She offered to remove all the spent grain, every load, every day, the year round, at her own cost and her own cartage, which meant the brewery need never send its 2 carters round to the waste ground again, which meant the £95 a year Croft paid to bury the stuff came off his books entirely, struck out, gone, saved. In return, she asked for it in writing, the exclusive right to the whole of the spent grain of Ansley and Croft, for a term of years. Hers alone, no other man to have a sack of it, set down in a paper with Croft's name on it and her name on it and Sowerby's seal. She would pay them nothing. And she would save them £95 a year, and she would take the nuisance off their ground that the Board of Health, sooner or later, would have made them clear at their own expense in any case. Sowerby wrote it fair, and Hannah carried it back to the brewery before her 14 days were up. They met in Sowerby's office, which was neutral ground, a small room with a table and 4 chairs and a window that gave onto the street. Croft came, and he brought Ferris. Sowerby sat at the head with the papers. Hannah sat across from the 2 brewery men with her hands folded in her lap, and on her lap, wrapped in a cloth, she had brought a thing. Sowerby read the contract aloud, the whole of it, slow, so there could be no mistaking a word. He read the term of years. He read Hannah's exclusive right that no person but Hannah Pettifer should have the spent grain of the brewery for the term. He read that she would remove the whole of it daily at her own charge, and he read the line that struck the carter's bill of £95 a year clean off the brewery's books. Croft sat with his own ledger before him, because a man like Croft brings his ledger everywhere, and he looked down the columns while Sowerby read, and Hannah watched him do the sum a second time. £95 a year to bury it. That was what it cost him now. Nothing to be rid of it, under this paper, and the nuisance gone, and the Board of Health's threat gone with it, for Hartle would come for him one day, they both knew it, and make him clear the ground at his own charge. Set against that, the 3 shillings a load he had dreamed of that morning in the counting house, and the £150 of arrears he had plucked out of the air, they were nothing. They were a threat he had made because a widow had let him see, too late, what he had been throwing away, and it had made him want to grab. But a man cannot grab a thing that was never his to sell in the first place, and he had no paper, and she had brought him one. Croft understood it all, sitting there, and Hannah watched him understand it. He said, at last, that it was a strange thing to be paid nothing and call it a good bargain. Sowerby said nothing. It was not his to answer, and Hannah unwrapped the cloth on her lap, and she set on the table, on top of the papers, a small brass thing, dulled with age and use, Tom's kiln thermometer, that had stood on her mantel these 7 years and gone with her to old Big's kiln and read the heat true through 2 hard winters. She set it down on the papers to hold them flat, and she said the only hard thing she said in the whole of it. She said, "You called it muck when it cost you money, Mr. Croft." She let that sit. Then she said, "Sign where it's worth 2,000. Croft looked at the brass thermometer on his contract for a long moment. Then he took the pen from Sowerby, and he signed. His hand was steady enough. A man who cannot bear a shilling to go out of the door does not, in the end, refuse to have £95 a year struck off his books, whatever it costs his pride to do it. Ferris stood by the door the whole while. He did not sit. He had been the one to say it before 11 ratepayers, worth less than the mud it rots into, and he stood now and watched his partner sign a paper that made a widow the sole owner of the worth of it, and he said not one word. There was nothing for him to say. The muck had a price after all, and it was near £2,000 a year, and the woman he had pitied held the paper. Hannah took up Tom's thermometer and wrapped it back in its cloth and put it on her lap, and Sowerby dried the ink, and it was done. She walked home the 4 miles again with a copy of the contract folded flat against her breast, and this time she did not wait until she was past the houses to let it show on her face. The next morning the whole of the town could see it, if the town cared to look. The 2 carters came, same as they had come every morning for 7 years, but not to tip. They came to Hannah's cart, which stood ready, and they loaded it under her direction, the same men who had turned 3 cartloads a day out on the ground behind her cottage, now filling her sacks and stacking them at her word. And then she drove it out, sweet and heavy, past the cottages of Marston Lane, where the neighbours stood in their doors. Some of those neighbours had sat in the vestry. Some of them had heard Ferris say his line about the muck and the mud, and had gone home saying nothing, because it was not their heap and not their fight. They watched her now drive her loaded cart out clean and sacked and paid for, and the waste ground behind the cottages lay bare and beginning to green over, for the tipping had stopped for good. The heap was gone, 7 years of it, gone to grass, and there was one book left to close. Mr. Hartle, the sanitary inspector, who had written no nuisance proven and closed the case and let the brewery's name subscribe his board, Hartle had to come, in the end, and enter into his own record what had become of the Marston Lane nuisance. He came and he looked at the bare ground where the heap had steamed, and he took out his book, and he had to write in it that the nuisance at Marston Lane was abated. Abated by private arrangement, he wrote. And to write it, he had to write her name. Hannah Pettifer. In his own hand, in the book that had held no nuisance proven for 7 years, he set down that the widow he had turned away had abated it herself. So there it was, the whole of it, and it came to a thing so plain that anyone might have seen it, and no one had, for 7 years. On the one side, a nuisance. 3 cartloads a day of sour spent barley, carted 4 miles or tipped on a widow's ground, bringing rats and a foul drain and a smell that soured the milk on her shelf, and costing the brewery £95 a year in carters to be rid of. That was what it had been. On the other side, the same barley, the very same, dried and sacked and sold to the dairies and the carriers and the racing stable, and coming to near £2,000 a year. And the whole of the difference between the two was not some new thing found under the ground. It was 3 days made into 3 months. It was preservation, fresh, the grain soured in 3 days, and was fit only for a pig or a heap. Dried right over Tom's flue, at Tom's heat, it kept for months and would travel as far as the rails would carry it. Hannah had not discovered a use for the stuff. The drover knew the use, and the drover's father before him, who had fed 40 beasts on it. She had done the one thing none of them had done. She had found the way to keep it. She did not find a use. She found the way to keep it. That was the whole of the fortune, and it had sat behind her cottage, steaming, for 7 years, while better men than her called it muck. 6 months on, if you had gone out to old Big's malting on the edge of Burton, you would not have known it for the disused place she rented for £1 a week. It was Hannah's drying house now. The kiln ran the year round, and the flue held its heat, and the whole of the long, low room was stacked with sacks to the beams, and the smell of it. The smell that had once soured her milk and driven her daughter gagging from the gate. The smell now was toasted and warm and good. The smell of a thing worth money. Ruth had come home from Derby. She kept the books at a little desk by the office window, and she kept them well, and she was not ashamed of the smell of the place, for the smell of the place was the smell of what her mother had made. A groom from the High-for-Long stable stood in the yard most mornings, waiting on his load, and passed the time with Ruth while he waited. And on the mantel of the little office, where once it had stood on the mantel of the cottage kitchen, sat Tom's brass kiln thermometer. Dulled, small, reading true. It had gone from the mantel to the rented kiln to the signing table, and back to a mantel again, and it read the heat as true as it had the day the kiln cough took the man who bought it. Ferris did not say muck any more. Croft kept his ledger, and there was a page in it, 7 years long, that he did not open if he could help it. Hannah Pettifer had wanted only to be left in peace, and not to be pitied. She had got a good deal more than peace. But she never did learn the drover's name. Gwilym had watered his cattle at the lane trough, and set his line and driven his beasts on, 4 miles and gone, and he never came back for thanks, and never knew what his idle word had made. Somewhere a Welshman was still driving cattle, who had handed a widow near £2,000 a year and never knew it. She thought of him sometimes. She hoped his own fortunes had run as well, and if there is a thing in all of it worth carrying away, it is only this, and it is a small, plain thing, the size of the ones she had learned to want. Nothing is refuse until someone decides not to keep it, and nothing is worthless once someone works out how. Tell me in the comments what everyone else threw away that you would have kept.